This is one of Sydney's corridor cars. This was the final type of tram car for Sydney. Very, very pleasing in appearance, even though their design now is many, many years old, having first been introduced in 1933 and built right through till 1936, and then in the early 1950s there were 100 built in the post-war years. There were 250 corridor cars constructed altogether. The first lot were R cars, and they had 2 doors in the centre and 3 internal compartments, and the latter batch were classified as R1 cars, and they had no internal compartments and only a single door in the centre. I'm sure you'll agree that these cars, in spite of their age, are still quite pleasant in appearance. One of the features that you should notice is that these are non-coupling cars. You'll notice there are no coupling arrangements on these. They're called direct control cars, and they could only run singly. One of the reasons for that is that by the time we got round to the early 1930s when these were built, the traffic had diminished considerably, and comfort became far more important than seating capacity. So we had the corridor car design, and the necessity to run them in pairs had ceased to exist. So what we'll do now, we'll go inside and have a look, because it's inside these cars that the major change took place. Now you'll notice quite a difference in the seating inside the corridor cars as compared to the crossbench cars. These had tip-over upholstered seats, and at the beginning and end of each run the conductor would proceed through the car, and he would then tip the seats over so that they faced in the direction of travel and the public didn't have to do it. All of these little services were appreciated by the travelling public. At the end of each car was a sliding door, which when closed kept all the inclement weather out and the various traffic noises. In the summer, of course, the old windows would be down. In the winter, you'd have them up. The major change between the pre-war and the post-war corridor cars is the ceiling. Now, in the pre-war ones, we had this tongued and groove ceiling, tongued and groove board ceiling, which was the fashion of the day. And in the post-war cars, of course, we had aluminium ceilings, which were a lot easier to install and a heck of a lot easier to paint, and quite a saving in maintenance costs. The timber in these cars was mostly Queensland maple. It was all Australian timber. In fact, the timber on the earlier cars, on our O's, the F's, the C's and all of those cars, was predominantly cedar and Tasmanian blackwood. They were the 2 major timbers used right up until the middle 1920s. Of course, by then both of those timbers became rather rare, and when these cars were built in the 30s, and the post-war cars, of course, they used the Queensland timbers and the other timbers which were in current use at the time. A couple of features about these cars, mainly relating to the wartime period. During the wartime period, these upper windows, this panel here, was blacked out by a masonite panel. Whoops, we'll just move that out of our way. Was filled in so that in the event of an air raid, you wouldn't be shattered with timber. Now what you had to do, the instructions were in an air raid, put the window down, and you would find that outside the window there was another wooden panel fitted which was level with the window, so you had closed, and this open proportion here. These panels here, on most of the trams, though they weren't all fitted, were covered with canary wire or half-inch mesh wire so that the glass wouldn't fly in and shatter all over everybody. And another little-known use of the corridor cars during the wartime period related mainly to those at Fort Macquarie Depot. Fort Macquarie, as you know, is where the Opera House now stands, and that depot, of course, was right down on the harbour and therefore subject to stringent blackout conditions. So there were no lights in Fort Macquarie Depot overnight. In fact, the men had to do the repairs on the cars, change the brake shoes and everything by limited torchlight down in the pits, I'm told. But the feature that I want to mention is the incendiary bomb buckets. Now, Fort Macquarie became the sanding depot, as it was known. There was a huge container of sand down there, and as all the trams passed around Fort Macquarie Loop, the buckets on them were checked for sand. They had little 3-gallon buckets which were full of sand, the idea being in the event of an air raid, incendiary bombs, which of course set fire to everything, these trams would be carrying the sand, which was the then only known means of putting them out. So these little buckets were there, and Fort Macquarie was the depot for filling them. I'm told by a reliable first-hand source that as we didn't have any air aids, fortunately, these buckets became cigarette butt containers, and were usually used by the travelling public to put their cigarettes out in by simply dossing them in the sand. So that's a little feature of the corridor cars which we use for this purpose that the average person perhaps would not be aware of.